I'm going to talk for 30, 40 minutes. It should leave plenty of time for questions. So feel free to type those in the chat, or I think at the end we can unmute folks. Jay is in charge of that, so I'm going to let him do the Q&A stuff. So I'm mostly going to be talking about heat pump water heaters. I've titled this Water Heating in All Electric Homes because I'm not going to be exclusively talking about heat pump water heaters, but mostly. My name's Robb Aldrich. I work with Stephen Winter Associates. We're architects and engineers and other building geeks. Offices in Boston, Connecticut. I'm in Connecticut, Manhattan, and DC. We work mostly on the East Coast, but all over the country and beyond, all over the world, really. Quite a few projects in Canada. And we focus on buildings, better buildings, all aspects, more healthy, efficient, sustainable, accessible, resilient. I am kind of an energy geek. I would say energy and IAQ focus mostly on residential, both single family and multifamily. That's all I'll say about that. Here's our website if you want to find out more. So before talking about water heating systems, I want to talk about hot water consumption. The first heat pump water heater evaluation project I did was, I started in 2001, I believe, here. This was in Connecticut, where I am now. And we saw, we went into a couple dozen homes, installed heat pump water heaters, monitored their performance, and monitored hot water consumption as part of that. And we saw average hot water consumption of 60 to 70 gallons a day in single family homes, in average single family homes. And that was really the norm for the time. This was not outside their normal range at all. 20 years ago, that was kind of how much hot water the average home used. That has changed a lot. That has come down dramatically. Now, what we see is 30 to 45 gallons of hot water a day. This is hot water, not total water, just to be clear. This is just hot water. And I've seen, much more rigorous studies show similar numbers, average consumption down in the low 40s. In apartments, it tends to be lower. Occupancy tends to be a little lower in apartments. And this is great. I think it's because of low flow fixtures, efficient appliances really becoming standard. I'm not sure that it's a lot because of attitudes or kind of personal habits. I think it's more on the technology side. But for whatever reason, I mean, it's not quite in half, but it's almost in half. Average hot water consumption has gone down dramatically in the past 20 years, which is great. And so before we talk about how to heat water efficiently, effectively, using less hot water is a very good place to start. So if you don't want fuels in your home, and that is very much a growing trend for many reasons, which I won't get into here, everybody probably is aware of them. Electric resistance tanks are kind of the standard. They are inexpensive. They are available. Everybody is familiar with them, easy to install, cheap to replace when they go bad. The number one problem is operating costs. Resistance is expensive to operate. And again, if you use half as much water, your water heating bills are going to be half as much, but still resistance is one of the more expensive ways to heat hot water. But it's still out there. Tankless electric resistance heaters exist, but I very, very rarely see them other than in kind of niche applications. They're more expensive, which is a deterrent. Kind of the appeal is they don't take up as much space and they don't have kind of standby losses. Even if your tank is really, really well insulated, you still might lose 5-ish% of the energy just as standby losses to the surroundings. Tankless water heaters don't have a tank. They don't have that standby loss. So you can really push 100% efficiency, 98, 99% efficiency without that standby loss. The big problem with tankless electric water heaters is the current draw. And this is why I almost never see them used. I mean, there are, if you had a whole house system and you were using 4 gallons a minute, 60-degree rise, that water heater would draw 150 amps. This would probably make require you to double your service. You'd need like a 400 amp service in your home instead of a 200 amp service. This is a deal breaker almost always. I very rarely see them, but they exist. So I wanted to mention them. And solar thermal is, it's there, it works. I used to be a proponent. I am no longer a proponent of solar thermal for single family homes in cold weather. Not because it doesn't work, because it's expensive and also expensive to maintain. This was a community in Western Massachusetts. You can see this is a duplex. You can see there's PV and solar thermal collectors on the roof. And we saw fantastic performance from these systems. Solar fraction of 80%, provided 80% of the water heating needs. However, in freezing climates, installed cost of solar water heating systems is usually 5 figures, $10,000 plus in my experience. I haven't priced it since COVID. I can't imagine it has gone down. But unless you have incentives, substantial incentives, it's really quite pricey. Here's just a snippet of the monitoring from one of these homes. You can see orange is the heat from the solar, gray is the heat from the gas. They had backup natural gas at these homes. And the solar provided by far the lion's share of the water heating. But the gas bill or the gas savings was less than $200 a year. This home did not use a lot of hot water. Heating that hot water with an efficient gas water heater would have cost around 200 bucks. So paying 10 grand for savings of 200 bucks a year, when you also might have maintenance costs of 100 to 200 bucks a year, it's not a winning cost proposition unless you have substantial incentives. And there are substantial incentives out there. With the price of PV plummeting, you can make a really strong argument that just putting a little extra PV on your roof and having an electric resistance tank is a lower cost, lower maintenance way to heat water than active solar thermal. So thermodynamically, solar thermal makes a lot of sense. Practically, cost effectively, not so much in my opinion. Single family in cold climates. Multifamily is a different story. Multifamily in cold climates, I think, deserves a closer look in a lot of situations. This is also in Western Massachusetts. This is an old schoolhouse that converted into 12 apartments. You can see there's evacuated tubes over the south-facing windows. You get better scale with multifamily buildings. This is a small multifamily, but we've also worked on projects with 100 plus units in New York City. Better scale, better load diversity. You're never any heat you collect from the sun you're using, you're never kind of wasting any heat as you often do in single family. And this project got really pretty crazy incentives. Installed cost was $31,000. After incentives, the installed cost was about $9,000. So it's not $9,000 of incentives, it's $22,000 of incentives, which was crazy. There were local, state, federal tax credits, they kind of whole bunch of different factors that went into lowering the cost. And here again, this provided 70% of the hot water needs. It was a much stronger sell on multifamily with better scale and fantastic incentives. So I think I'd be surprised. I've been kind of surprised that there hasn't been a closer look at solar thermal for multifamily buildings. We may see more of that. So mostly I'm going to talk about heat pump water heaters. Do a time check. All right, I'm in good shape. Specifically integrated tank heat pump water heaters like I'm showing here. So the principle, and I'm going to spend a fair bit of time on this. There's a tank of water, 50 or 80 gallons are the kind of the most common volumes I see, but there are other products with other volumes out there. There's a blower which draws in warm air, hopefully warm air from the surroundings. There's a heat pump which uses vapor compression to extract heat from that air and move that heat into the water in the tank below, and then cool air gets discharged on the other side. Here's one installed in the basement. We see a lot of them installed in basements in the Northeast. It works pretty well. I will call out, most tanks, not all, but most have backup heating elements that will kick in when, if the heat pump can't keep up. And various manufacturers have different controls. But if you're using a lot of hot water in a short period of time, a lot of water heaters will kick on these resistance elements to keep up with the hot water demand, or try to keep up with hot water demand. So here again, there's another simple schematic. Blower draws in warm air, blows out cool air, heat gets moved into the water. The heat pump capacities are around 5,000 to 10,000 BTUs an hour. This also varies from manufacturer to manufacturer. And this capacity is like, it's right in the ballpark of a window air conditioner. And this, I've had people say, this is a great analogy. They start to get it. If you put a heat pump water heater in your basement, it's like you're putting a window air conditioner in your basement that runs 5 or 6 hours a day. It really cools off the space, which may or may not be a problem, depending on the conditions, depending on the time of year, configuration. It extracts heat from the space, from the incoming air, moves that heat into the water, and then discharges cool air and drier air. It does dehumidify also. So at the risk of beating a dead horse, heat pump water heaters remove heat from incoming air, transfer that heat into the water, and then discharge cooler air. Generally it's around 200 CFM. Again, that varies, 100, 150, 200, maybe more for some bigger models. And generally that air is 20 degrees cooler. So if it's 70 degree incoming air, 50 degree discharge air, 200 CFM, which is pretty substantial. That's a fair bit of cool air. And I'm belaboring this because I see these products misapplied so often, and I've seen the same mistakes. People keep making the same mistakes for decades. So anyways, that's why I'm belaboring this point. So we've done a few evaluations. This is a little bit of data from a study that's actually like 10 years old now, but the technology has gotten a little bit more efficient. You can see the rated energy factor of the units we tested a decade ago were in the 2.3, 2.5 range. Now you'll see rated energy factors 3 plus, probably 3 to 3.5. So of the dozen or two, somewhere between 1 and 2 dozen water heaters we evaluated in basements in New England, the average COP is 1.8. So a word about COP and energy factor. COP stands for coefficient of performance. It's kind of like efficiency. It's very similar to efficiency. So a COP of 1.8 is kind of like 180% efficient. Of course, that's not possible, but basically that if you have a COP of 2, for every joule of electricity you use, you put 2 joules of heat into the water. And the reason it can appear to be above 100% efficient is because you're using that electricity to extract heat from the basement air and move that heat into the water. So it's not really more than 100% efficient, but it's kind of how you can think of it, as long as you remember where the heat's coming from. So, if you did this test in a lab and you followed all the right procedures, your COP would be the same as your energy factor. That the water heaters are labeled with. So average COP was 1.8, which was not bad compared to the listed of 2.3, 2.5, but we had a staggering range in COPs. We had one COP that was actually higher than the energy factor, and I've evaluated a lot of products in a lot of buildings, and you don't often see real world performance exceeding the kind of literature efficiencies. That's a surprise. It was encouraging. But we also saw one heat pump that had a COP of 1. That's basically 100% efficient. It's really not much better than just an electric resistance tank. And there was one home had this heat pump water heater in it. The reason this had such a low efficiency was it was installed in a basement like this one, but it wasn't this one, but it was installed in kind of an abandoned wing of the basement. Had a really convoluted geometry, and there was like this, we went down a long hallway to get this abandoned wing of the basement, and that's where the heat pump water heater was. The heat pump water heater would extract heat out of this abandoned section of the basement and cool off that basement area down below 50 degrees. And that once you get down into the 40 to 50 degree range, most heat pump water heaters will stop working or stop working efficiently. So that's what happened. This space got cooled down into the 40s, the heat pump stopped working, and resistance kicked in. That happened all year. Even in the summer, the heat pump couldn't keep up because it cooled down this space too quickly. There wasn't enough heat for the heat pump to operate. And this brings me to really some of the keys for efficiency. I mentioned the resistance elements in many of these systems before. I circled them here in this little diagram. One of the most important ways to maximize your efficiency is to minimize how often these elements operate. So use the heat pump as much as possible, use resistance elements as little as possible. And some counterintuitive ways to do that, one is a bigger tank. So if you get an 80-gallon tank compared to a 50-gallon tank, you have 60% more hot water. Am I doing my math right? I think so. 60% more hot water to take showers, to do laundry or whatever, before the heat pump needs to, kick into high gear with the resistance to recover hot water more quickly. Bigger tanks are more efficient. We saw that absolutely in all the evaluations that we did. Also, hotter water is better. Again, if you store your water at 140 instead of 120, you have a lot more energy to use before resistance has to kick in. You want to temper that water. You want to put a tempering valve so don't have scalding water coming out of the taps for sure. But here again, these are counterintuitive. Like most people, when you talk about mechanical systems, like, oh, don't oversize, just right size, keep it cooler, don't make it hotter. With heat pump water heaters, at least this type of heat pump water heater, the opposite is true. Bigger and hotter tends to be better. And I mean, you can take this to an extreme. If you have a studio apartment with one person in it, you don't need an 80-gallon tank at 160 degrees or anything. But generally in single family homes, I generally recommend 80 gallons over 50 gallons. So you can limit how often those resistance heaters come on. Warmer intake air is better. The minimum for most of these heat pump water heaters that mostly use 134A, although this is changing. Refrigerants are changing, which we can talk about a little bit later, perhaps. Once you get down below 40 degrees, they generally stop working entirely. You want to be above 50 degrees really for the best efficiency, and warmer is better. The warmer, the better. And also my last bullet, if you use less hot water, obviously you need less energy to heat that water, but also using less water like in intense bursts. Like if there's one laundry day and you do 8 loads of laundry, well, the heat pump's probably not going to keep up with that. You're probably going to kick into resistance mode, even though your average water consumption might be very reasonable. If you use all your hot water in very short bursts, the heat pump likely can't keep up. So good applications. You want to have enough air volume around your heat pump water heater. A lot of manufacturers say to have either minimum of 750 or 1,000 cubic feet. So 1,000 cubic feet is 10 by 10 by 10 or thereabouts. You can duct them, and we'll talk about ducting options in a little bit. But in addition to that sufficient volume, there has to be heat in that air. I mentioned that one basement that was in an abandoned wing of the house, that had sufficient volume for sure. It just didn't have any sources of heat. So the heat pump would cool down this abandoned section of basement, and there would be very little heat gain back into the basement for the heat pump to work effectively. So there has to be volume, there has to be heat. If you can locate these devices where the cooling and dehumidification is beneficial, fantastic. Basements in the summer, at least, tend to be pretty good. And also locate systems where the noise and the cold air won't bother people. Again, in basements, it's typically true that the noise and the cold air won't bother people. Further south, you might see them in garages in non-freezing climates. You know, maybe a garage in Orlando might work great. But in the Northeast and freezing climates, almost always I see them in the successful installations are basements. Every once in a while, there'll be a big mechanical room in a home, but basements are really where I see them the most in this neck of the woods. So if you don't have a basement, what do you do? This is a simple little schematic. It's kind of like a, you know, 1-bedroom apartment, but it applies if you don't have a basement. I mean, it could be a slab on grade or a crawl space. If you don't have a basement to put your heat pump water heater in, don't put it in closets. Don't do this. Here's your closet. This is actually a closet. This is in a multifamily building. One of my colleagues took this picture, and this is taken from the outside. So the door to the closet goes to the outdoors. There are so many things wrong with this picture. It's horrifying. Nothing wrong with this equipment. You know, I think the heat pump water heater brand product is fine. I don't think you can get the cover off the electric panel. I think the electric panel cover is wedged on by the heat pump water heater. We have crushed the edge of the drain pan trying to get it in. And this is just there's not enough heat in the air in this closet for the heat pump to work. The heat pump will turn on. It'll suck the heat out of the air in the closet. The closet will get down into the 45 degrees or whatever, and the heat pump will shut off. There's just no more heat for the heat pump to work. Backup resistance elements will do it. So somebody ran an extension cord and plugged in a resistance heater to try to heat this closet, which is absurd. You know, if you're going to heat the closet with resistance heat and then use a heat pump to move the resistance heat into the water, just heat with the resistance water heater. It doesn't work. Louvers. I've seen this suggested quite a few times. All right, I'll have it in the closet, but I'll put a louvered door. In my experience, this just does not work. You know, if you put a window air conditioner in this closet with a louvered door, that closet's still going to be really, really cold, you know, unless you force the air mechanically in and out of this louvered door. That closet is still going to be too cold for the heat pump water heater to operate. I've seen many people try this and they have all failed. I've seen some like installation manuals, heat pump water heater installation manuals that suggest this as an option, which kind of disturbs me because I don't think it works. As an aside, the manager of this, the building manager for this apartment building, one of the things they tried was putting louvers in the door leading to outside. So this was in upstate New York. So when it's 20 degrees outside, you have some nice 20-degree air getting into the closet with a heat pump water heater. It was a disaster. I mean, and this was an example where people just didn't get it. You know, the building owner didn't get it. Utilities sponsored this. You know, I talked to the building manager. He said, utilities were begging me to install these. They were throwing money at me. They paid me more money than it cost to install them. So he buckled, he installed them. They were a complete failure. They ripped them all out and put electric resistance back in. So really be thoughtful. It's a great technology, but you have to think about where and how you apply it. Okay, I gotta move a little bit. So this picture is taken kind of through a louvered door. The louvered door is open, and we have a heat pump water heater and an air handler with a kind of return grill. An unducted return, which is a whole different can of worms, which I won't talk to right now. But this kind of air handler drew air into this closet, which partially solved the problem of the heat pump not having enough heat. But one of my colleagues measured the sound pressure levels in the space outside of the closet. I think it was like the kitchen or the dining area, 53 decibels, which is just too loud to be comfortable. You don't want a 53 decibel noise while you're trying to watch TV, or certainly while you're sleeping. These things make some noise. They're getting quieter. Hopefully they'll continue to get more quiet, but they do make noise, and that is an issue for installing them in or near living space. I remember hearing a presentation from one like evaluator who went through a multifamily building, and in every apartment they installed a heat pump water heater, and he was floored that half of the water heaters were put into resistance mode. So I switched them all into heat pump mode. He came back a few weeks later, and most of them were back in resistance mode. He couldn't understand it. To me, it's stunningly obvious. People put them into quiet mode. They put them into quiet mode because they don't want to hear these things while they're sleeping or living in their apartments. They can be noisy. So, ducting. Many of the heat pump water heaters have options for ducting either the intake or the discharge. So if you have a louvered door and then you maybe have a register above that louvered door where you blow the cold air out and you bring the warm air back in, maybe this would solve it. Maybe you would have warm enough air to operate the heat pump water heater. Big concern here is the noise. Again, right next to a bedroom in this little schematic, I would be really concerned about noise and maybe comfort of blowing 200 CFM of 50-degree air out into the apartment or the home. If you ducted both sides and you did really good kind of sound dampening, you had like a gasketed door and sealed all the cracks, okay, I can see that mitigating the sound concerns. Now you have an intake duct and an exhaust duct. You're not drawing in, you should have warm enough air for the heat pump to operate. Is this air going to be a comfort problem? Maybe, maybe not. It probably depends on the configuration. It depends on the occupants. Just something to be aware of. This is not a definite go or no go, but it's a maybe. Be careful. Now, what about ducting to outdoors? This question comes up a lot. First of all, you always want to balance, so you don't have like 200 CFM of uncontrolled infiltration coming from who knows where. I'm in Connecticut. The average annual air temperature in Connecticut is right about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. That's kind of the cutoff for where these heat pumps start or stop working well. So half the year, maybe the heat pump would work well, and the other half the year, it might be in resistance mode. It's better than resistance all year, so be thoughtful. Of course, you have more wall penetrations here, which are issues for sealing. When it's 15 degrees outside, you have to be worried about cool 15-degree air kind of just coming in through the ducts out where your plumbing is. If you lose power, there's potential issues here. But think about it, be creative, but just be thoughtful how you apply these systems. This is a strategy which I've heard suggested but never seen implemented, but it seems like it might be interesting. If you're in an apartment building, you have a closet that opens onto the corridor, louvered door, and you discharge out into the corridor. Sound dampen to the apartment, so there's not a sound concern. You got to be really thoughtful about heating this corridor. You're going to have to add some extra heat to the corridor to make up for the heat that goes into the water heater. Maybe might be more trouble than it's worth. But again, I've seen people consider some pretty clever solutions. This is an apartment building, which was an old mill that was repurposed into apartments. And you can see a heat pump water heater this is an intake duct, which flex duct could have been done a little better, in my opinion. But what happens, it draws air from a register high up near the ceiling. These are kind of high ceiling, lofty apartments. And then the cool discharge just goes into this mechanical closet, and this mechanical closet has a louvered door, so that air kind of just oozes back into the apartment. There are 80-ish apartments in this development, and it works okay. Certainly in the summer, it works pretty fine, but there are complaints about noise, about comfort, and just general performance. So last winter, the building maintenance folks had to switch a quarter of these heat pump water heaters into resistance mode just for the winter. And next winter, or this coming winter, What they want to do is be preemptive and go move all of the water heaters to resistance mode just to mitigate the worst of the comfort concerns during the winter. I'm not sure if they're going to do that, but that's what the maintenance guy I talked to really wants to do. So yeah, better than resistance, maybe a lot better than resistance, certainly for a lot of the year. But there are concerns, so be mindful. In a multifamily application, I'm not going to dwell too much on this, but a lot of heat pumps extracting heat from a small mechanical room. This was in Connecticut. When my colleague went to inspect this building, there's a big resistance heater up in the corner. On the other end, there's another big resistance heater up in the corner. These were running several hours a day in August. That's bad. This was, people just didn't get it. The MEP didn't get it. The installer didn't get it. The utilities provided great incentives for this. Nobody understood how these systems work. So what you have is a very expensive electric resistance water heating plant that got great utility incentives. Don't do that. Be more thoughtful. There are strategies where you could do a central plant. You just need to be careful about spacing or ducting, and you need to think about adding back heat into the space. It could come from outdoors. It could come from another heat pump. There are certainly options that could get you way above resistance, better than resistance for sure, but you have to be careful. You have to be thoughtful. So I've given a lot of examples about things that are going wrong. So I wanted to come back and say, this is good technology. In single family homes installed in basements, I see them work very, very often. It's the exception that there are problems. I have seen people install heat pump water heaters in basements. Actually, one BrightBuilt home, folks installed it in the basement, and just the basement was too cold. They couldn't stand it. They went down to do laundry and it was just too cold. They took it out and installed the resistance heater. I've talked to many other folks in zero energy homes, true zero energy homes, where they install these in a basement and it's absolutely fine. They can't imagine why anybody would have a problem. Maybe the inverters are in the basement. They kick off some waste heat. Maybe there's a chest freezer in the basement that kicks off some waste heat. Be thoughtful. But it's a good technology. It certainly works in the right application. So the last thing I want to talk about, or close to the last thing I want to talk about, is split systems. Or, well, here's like a simple little schematic. We have a heat pump outdoors. We have a tank indoors. If you can move the heat pump outdoors, like for a mini split or a split system for space conditioning, you solve the noise problems, you solve the cold air blowing on people problems. Maybe you can solve the efficiency problem, hopefully, with the right equipment. There's two kind of flavors. One has all the refrigeration components outside, and you actually pump cold water out to the heat pump and you pump warm water back into the storage tank. Other systems actually have refrigerant lines that connect indoors and outdoors. And there are certainly reasons for this. Terminology, some people call all of these types of systems split because there's a tank inside and there's an outdoor unit outside. Some people refer to the systems that have the water connecting indoors and outdoors monobloc. So basically all the heat pump components, all the refrigeration happens outside and you pump water out and back from your storage tank. Some people call those monobloc. You might hear that term used in some cases. Here is a single family home. Out back, there are three. The lower three are space conditioning heat pumps, and this top one is the water heater. It looks pretty similar to the mini split outdoor units. Here's the indoor tank. It has worked very, very well. I haven't monitored this in detail. This is colleagues who've been in the house for a year and a half at this point. Very happy with the performance. All the evaluations I've seen have shown really good performance in cold weather. This is a CO2 based. The refrigerant for this system is carbon dioxide, which is a very good refrigerant for water heating. It can work really well at cold outdoor temperatures, and it can provide really hot water temperatures, which is nice, which is very useful. The biggest concern I have is the water lines. So there's water coming in and coming out. Pull the water outdoors in the winter makes me nervous, and I think that's reasonable. You know, this manufacturer has guidelines on how to deal with that. You insulate the pipes very well. Obviously, they have heat trace that can go in the pipes that can operate if the heat pump fails. But if the power goes out, and obviously the heat pump fails, and it's 15 degrees for a couple days or even one night, then they have some kind of valving that will automatically drain the pipes. But you really have to be thoughtful. You have to pay attention to this. That's the number one complaint I've heard from these systems is water freezing. This particular home, they have PV, they have battery. So even if the power goes out, they still should have power enough to run their heat pumps, or at least some of their heat pumps, and keep those lines from freezing. So I just said all of this on the last slide, mostly. Carbon dioxide systems, very promising, I think. There's other systems with R410A. Some of the systems are designed, or at least have the potential to be used for space heating as well as water heating, which is appealing to some people. I'm not going to get into that too much here. The CO2 systems, one thing I've heard repeatedly is that they are very, very particular to water quality. If you have hard water, if you have dirty water, that's a problem. You probably have to get a softener or treat the water or filter the water somehow, so your heat pump will operate properly. And the other thing is cost. The costs I've seen are 3 to 5 times more than the integrated packaged tanks that we were talking about earlier. Maybe even higher than that. They're quite a bit more expensive. Keep that in mind. So my last slide. Unfortunately, or as the case may be, heat pump water heating has a lot of potential. We use it in a lot of applications, but there are other applications where, for now, we default back to electric resistance. In multifamily buildings, especially, where there's not a good heat pump solution to put a water heater in every apartment. It is easy to put a kind of a low boy 40-gallon electric resistance storage tank in every apartment. It's easy, it's inexpensive, it's easy to replace. It's not as efficient as it could be, but if you just pay excellent attention to insulating, get a very well insulated water heater, insulate your pipes, keep your plumbing runs short, insulate your plumbing runs, efficient appliances, low flow fixtures. If you have to use recirc, use demand controlled recirc, which we could talk about a little bit if folks have questions. If you're really, really thoughtful about using less hot water and having an efficient water heating system, electric resistance tanks are not the end of the world. And unfortunately, we default, well, I guess unfortunately, we default back to those quite often in a lot of projects. But I would not throw in the towel on heat pump water heaters. Keep tabs on this. Technology is changing, so we're always looking for new, better options. So I encourage you to do the same thing. And I'm going to stop talking now, and we should have 20-ish minutes or so for questions.
Hi, Rob. Thanks. That was a terrific presentation.
Yeah,
Oh,
thank
cool.
you so much.
We do have a couple of questions that came in. I guess the first one I'll go to is, in a new build, where would the most opportune positioning be?
The most opportune positioning for the heat pump water heater, probably.
Correct.
I mean, if it's an integrated tank, probably a basement. And if you can think about where the plumbing goes, if your kind of kitchens and bathrooms are kind of in the same section of the home, put the water heater under the kitchens and the bathrooms, so your plumbing runs are shorter and straighter, for sure. But yeah, in single family homes, almost all the successful applications I've seen are in the basements, where the noise and the cold air discharge isn't going to bother anybody. Yeah, I'm not sure if there's more specifics on that, but that's what I would say.
I think that was to the point of the question. The second one here is it detrimental to turn it off in the winter when not home? So if they're closing the home down to maybe go south or something like that.
I don't think so. I haven't heard of, well, I should say I haven't heard one way or the other if there are any. I can't think of anything that would make these more susceptible to kind of winterization. I know people that will switch them into, like I mentioned, switch them into resistance for the winter where there's just not enough heat in the basement or the cold air is uncomfortable in the basement. They'll switch it to resistance mode. I haven't heard too much about people shutting them off entirely, but on the spur of the moment, I can't foresee any big issues.
Very good. We have one here that how do folks measure the COP of their specific systems?
That's not easy. So I mean, when we measured COP, we installed, we install water meters to monitor flow in real time, inlet water temperature, outlet water temperature, power consumption, the heat pump, power consumption, the resistance elements. It was pretty more high tech than a kind of average consumer consumer devices, very customized. So I don't know. I guess one thing I would say that might be useful is monitoring. Sorry, I just had an alarm go off. Let me turn that off. There are more and more, and Parlin, I mentioned this to you, there are more and more devices that let you monitor how much electricity certain appliances are using, or circuits. I mentioned like the Emporia system, which I just kind of found out about recently, installed in my house. You can monitor the whole house power consumption and then up to 16 circuits in your home for, I think, $150. So the heat pump water heater could certainly be one of those circuits, and you could really keep tabs on how much electricity your water heater is using. It doesn't tell you the COP necessarily or how much hot water you're using, but I think that could be really informative for folks. And certainly if you see a big spike, it's like, oh, it must have been in resistance last night or last week or something. I don't know of any kind of easy ways to monitor COP for most people.
Very good. At the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned EF, and someone said, is that the same as UEF?
Yeah, so energy factor got kind of updated. The regulations got updated. And now you'll often see UEF, which I think is uniform energy factor. So yeah, I can't speak to exactly what the differences is. I'd have to refresh my memory on all the regulations, but in general, yes. So EF or UEF are kind of the rated efficiency factors for water heaters.
I have a question from the group that was posed prior to this, but is there any difference, or what are you seeing between heat pumps versus geothermal?
So, or like air source versus ground source heat pumps. So I've not seen people install a ground source heat pump, especially for water heating, first of all. But if they're going ground source for their space conditioning, I definitely have seen, water to water heat pumps use the same ground field to heat the water for the home, for sure. And I mean, my thoughts, ground source is technology. It's certainly viable. It certainly works. I rarely recommend it because it's really expensive. And there are a lot of incentives out there for it, incentives and tax credits, but in my mind, it's usually not worth the added expense. I would say add another 500 watts or a kilowatt of PV, and that might make up for the difference between ground source and air source. Of course, it varies with application. It varies on a lot of different things. But certainly if you're doing a ground source heat pumps for space conditioning, considering ground source for water heating also certainly makes sense to me.
Great. I'll let Parlin take over.
Okay. Yeah, I've got a couple that have just come in through the chat, as well as a couple others in the Q&A. So I'll start with those. One quick one was, can you give a real life noise comparison for how much noise they make?
Yeah, right. Nobody, very few people know what decibels mean. But I thought one of the best maybe analogies was like a dehumidifier. If you have a
Yeah.
dehumidifier in your basement, I have a dehumidifier in my basement, and it doesn't bother me. If it were in a closet next to my bedroom, that would really bother me.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the same comparison I've heard as well.
Okay. They're much, it's much louder than a fridge.
Yeah. Yep.
You know,
This is a sort of a pointed question to BrightBuilt, and I think you and I have had a discussion about this, Rob, but the question is, what type of water heater does BrightBuilt recommend for their ADUs, the accessory dwelling units, resistance or heat pump? And per the conversation we had, and this might also address another question that came in with regard to ceiling height in a basement. If you have a full basement, stands to reason that a heat pump hot water heater would be usable in that space for the ADU. But if you don't, if you have crawl space or something less than a standard height basement, then an electric resistance is likely to make the most sense in those cases, right?
yeah, I think for now, probably, yeah. You asked specifically, are there kind of horizontal or low heat pump water heaters? And there are not, to my knowledge. That's not to say you couldn't get creative and get there are heat pump water heaters out there that don't kind of include a tank. You could kind of bring your own tank, and you could attach a different tank to a kind of it'd be a custom built kind of situation. That one of the reasons is that they're all fairly tall and vertical. First, that's the most common form factor for water heaters. They're mostly tall and vertical. But the other is that the heat pumps make use of the stratification. So to operate more efficiently, the cooler water's on the bottom, the warm water's on top. So the heat pump water heaters will make use of that to get more efficiency, because they can more efficiently heat the cooler water on the bottom. So if you have a horizontal tank or a shorter tank, you don't have that. And that could actually be a pretty good efficiency hit.
Yeah.
And the other thing to keep in mind is, if this is like an ADU, there's probably not a lot of hot water consumption. I would hope.
Right.
And then,
So,
maybe one more PV module to power the resistance. Yeah, it's a balancing act.
Yeah. Okay, there are several questions about it sounds like maybe compensating for generating heat passively or putting the unit into a space that's already warm. So one, I'll ask them kind of in sequence. Only winter heat source in a cold climate that I can think of is locating in a greenhouse room addition. Any examples of that? And then to follow on that, there's any experience placing in passive solar space, i.e. removed south face window room. So it sounds like people are thinking about creating spaces that are warmed by the sun in order to compensate for the heat extraction of the unit.
I've heard people talk about it. I don't think I've seen people do it, but it's awesome to hear creative ideas. One of my first thoughts is, do the math about how much heat these things, and you can do the math. You can calculate how much heat they're going to use, remove from the space based on how much hot water you use. And also, there are long, cold, dark winter nights where the solar gains are much, much less, and people generally want hot water 24 hours a day, or certainly 5:30 or 6 when you wake up in the morning, when there hasn't been any sun for 12 or 14 hours or whatever. No, not that long, but many hours. So yeah, there's the rub. Do the math, think about how much heat these pull out, and especially think about those winter conditions. And maybe there's times, all right, during January, I'll put it in panels on over my glass and run it in resistance. Yeah, power to you, be creative. But I haven't seen that. I don't think I've seen that been pulled off really effectively.
Okay, only remaining question in the queue for the live questions is this, and then I have a few I want to go through that were selected out of the questions that we fielded in the RSVP form. So this I think is a quick one and maybe climate specific, but it's asked if part of the cellar is a garage, would it be best to place in the garage section of a cellar?
So on the garage, I mean, it really depends what the temperature of that garage is. I mean, some people have heated insulated garages. It seems fairly decadent to me in most cases, but this may be, I don't know what this exact configuration is. Pay attention to what the temperature is, especially in the winter, both from the point of view that, for the heat pump to operate efficiently, you have to have at least 40 to 50 degree air. And also, even more important is freeze protection. In January, how low does that garage get? How cold does that garage get? And is there any risk of freezing? So I can't say more than that without looking at specifics. I am generally cautious on such things, and my knee jerk is to recommend against that, but yeah, look at the specifics, look at the details, and consider both those factors.
Okay, a lot of the questions that were asked ahead of time were addressed in your presentation. So there are a few that were kind of specific enough that it seemed like it was worth bringing them up. One is, this is a long one. I know you've seen this, but I'll read through it. My new net zero home construction will have a rooftop solar PV array. My plan is to have the solar array installed about 1 year after home completion, and then possibly a backup battery system installed 1 to 2 years after that. So the electrical work for the home construction will be done well before these later two stages. Is there anything that the home construction electrician needs to incorporate into his design in order to accommodate the electrical systems that the future solar array and battery backup systems will require? So it's not specific to domestic hot water, it looks like, but they're asking about the electrical needs. So I was thinking initially when I read this that it had specifics to the domestic hot water, but yeah, so I don't know if that's pertinent to.
So on the electrical side, I mean, most of the integrated tank heat pump water heaters, they just need a 30 amp double pole breaker, similar to what most resistance tanks need. So that's not a stretch for an electrician. I think, if you're looking to get battery backup down the road or put solar on down the road, I forget the order. If you want the water heater on if you have like an emergency sub panel that runs when the grid goes down, if you want your water heater on that, that's something to think about sooner rather than later. And I've seen people both ways. Some people think, depends how much battery you have. Some people, hot water is an absolute necessity. For other people, I can get by with heating water on the stove for a few days while the power's out. So yeah, it's not, 30 amp double pole breakers is usually what you need, but certainly check and keep in mind if you want it on your emergency panel, your backup panel, if that's your configuration.
Great. Okay. I think we've addressed a lot of them. Let me just do a couple rapid fire. I don't know if you're allowed to answer this question, but is the Rheem heat pump hot water heater the best to buy?
So yeah, I intentionally didn't talk about brand names. Usually I can't. I don't know if you guys are offering CEUs. I forgot to ask you, but certainly if you're using.
Yeah, we're not.
All right, then I can say names. Yeah. I wouldn't. I think in my experience, all the ones that are out there are viable. All the ones I've seen, I wouldn't recommend one over the other. If there are certain ducting configurations you want, they don't all support all the same ducting configurations. So if I want to duct the discharge, I want to duct the intake and the discharge, you might have to look at that, because the blower and the blower has to handle whatever, certain different duct lengths and static pressures, et cetera, et cetera. So there are limitations on that side of things. The one water heater that, and this is going back a while, and I'm not up to date on all the products that are out there, but in the evaluations that we did a decade ago, Stiebel Eltron came in at the top. They're German, they're distributed through Massachusetts, and they were, I said most water heaters have backup resistance elements. They don't. They have a tiny little 1 kilowatt element, whereas most have like 4.5 or 5 kilowatt backup elements, just like regular water heaters. The Stiebel Eltron has a much higher capacity heat pump, bigger volume of tank. The controls keep the tank hotter. So it's, bigger, hotter, bigger capacity heat pump, smaller capacity resistance, and considerably more expensive. So that was the trade-off. So I think I haven't done a detailed survey of all the products that are out there. And I certainly don't have firsthand experience with all the products that are out there. But that was the one that kind of stood out. It was a different product. It was kind of a premium product, but in our evaluations, it paid off on the efficiency front.
Nice.
And Sandin is the CO2 based heat pump water heater with the outdoor unit, which again, I tried not to say during the presentation. That's the split or the monobloc system that I think has a lot of potential and risk of water freezing.
Right. Okay, well, we are at 1 o'clock, so I think that wraps us up for the hour, but thank you so much, Rob, for an amazing presentation and great information. And thanks to everyone who joined us today. We did record this, so we'll have this available and distributed out to those who RSVP'd in the future. So thanks again, Rob, and thanks to everyone.
Yeah, thanks. Take care.